back to my channel. This is actually the relaunch of my channel, as it's been some time since I last posted a video. That said, I'm nearing the completion of my dissertation, and so I am recommitting to uploading videos on a more regular basis. If you're new to the channel, I'm Miguel Benitez, and I'm on a relentless pursuit of goodness, truth, and beauty. And this channel allows you to join me in that journey. And so for my first video back, I have a friend of mine and a repeat guest of this channel, Michael Jahosky. Michael Jahosky is a humanities professor at St. Petersburg College. It's his 13th year. That's crazy, man.
Crazy.
That's wild.
It happened fast.
And he is the author of The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle Earth, which I actually have with me right here.
Thank you so much.
And you are the creator and host of the podcast Mythic Mission. Michael has a master's degree in humanities, 2 bachelor's degrees, one in history and the other in classical humanities. He's married to Sarah, and together they have 2 incredible kids, Lucas and Annabelle. So welcome back, Michael, and thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure is mine. Thank you so much again for having me back on the show.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to kind of the relaunch in this way. I'm excited. This is a conversation I've wanted to have with you for a while, and I thought perfect place to do it is on the YouTube channel. So
likewise.
So what we're going to be doing today is we are going to be having a conversation about C.S. Lewis's essay, Meditation in a Toolshed. And I was actually talking to Michael about this before we started recording, but he's actually the one that turned me on to this essay. So a little interesting kind of note. So Michael's J.R.R. Tolkien's scholar, and he wrote this wonderful book, which I highly recommend, and I'll put a link to it in the description. Interesting little tidbit, and then we'll move on. I actually have a chapter coming out in a book that should be out by the end of the year, and I actually cite you in it, Michael. So you'll actually I think appreciate some of the connections that I try to make there.
I can't wait to read it, and thank you. I'm honored.
It'll be great.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, and so so Michael's a Tolkien scholar. I do more of my research with G.K. Chesterton. I'm less familiar with Tolkien. You're less familiar with Chesterton, but I think C.S. Lewis is where our interests collide, right? I think we both have a great appreciation for Lewis. But so this is an essay that I was not familiar with before.
I'm surprised
at
that.
I saw that you assign it in one of your classes, or have assigned it in one of your classes. And I thought, that's great. We teach very similar classes. We're both humanities professors. And so I read it and I'm like, oh, this is a must read now. Like this is,
Definitely.
So I've assigned it every semester since in all of my humanities classes. So, so let me ask you, why is it that you've assigned it in your humanities classes in the past?
Yeah. So before the show, I was telling you I was going to look around to see when this was. It was 2 years ago in the fall semester of 2021. Trying to find the exact post, but I was on a Lewis kick again because I had been trying to cook up a new book idea because of I think it was Louis Marcos who told me there was so much, or maybe it was Brad Berger. There's so much Lewis in my book that I should write a separate book on Lewis, and so I'm still working on that. But something I was on a kick on reading about epistemology, and this for those of you that don't know, this C.S. Lewis essay is in the collection known as God in the Dock, kind of a legal term, and it's probably one of the most famous collection of essays. And I was reading a lot of Myth Became Fact, which is also in there, along with some other famous ones. And was doing a lot of that for what I was reading at the time. And I had, come by this one again, and I was reading a lot about epistemology, and I realized that Lewis scholars have recognized this as basically a short love letter, really, to sound Christian epistemology. And it's a beautifully short essay. It's got lots of vivid imagery. And I thought, I think while maybe the image of being in a shed might not speak to everybody, everyone could picture it. It was vividly enough written vividly enough that I think people could relate. And I just thought, well, why not? And it's I give my students who are generally young, although not always. I've got a guy in his 70s this summer who's just terrific, by the way. I give it, to them to read and, basically, to learn about basic critical thinking skills. So I thought, why not? So it was just kind of, I was reading it, so why not make my students read it? And it was a success. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So before you give a brief summary of the essay, you use this word epistemology. And just for the audience members that maybe aren't as familiar with that term, what is epistemology?
Yeah, so the way I understand it is it's a compound Greek word. Episteme, I believe, is one of the Greek nouns for knowledge, and logos is the suffix we attach to mean a great many things. The word logos can mean a great many things, but it means the study of knowledge. So that's maybe the literal definition, but I've always said epistemology is the contemplation or study of how we know what we know, but also what constitutes or counts for knowledge. Right. And so I think that's a bit more difficult to tease out, but I always like to focus on the how, whereas metaphysics, which can be translated as going beyond physics, which is a physical science, is the what's of knowing. What we know, epistemology is how we know.
Okay, very good. And so, can you just give us a brief summary? And for those who aren't familiar with the essay, I'll actually post a link to the essay in the description so that you can read it. I definitely want to encourage everybody, if you haven't read it, please read it.
Please do.
But yeah, if you could just tell us just a brief summary of the essay.
Sure. I mean, and I'm just looking as far as I had just copied and pasted it, from my Kindle onto a Word document. It's only like 2 pages and a few
Yeah,
lines into the. It's
that's
a
right.
very short essay, folks. So,
Yeah.
if any students are watching this or other interested parties, it's a very light read. It's not going to tax you too much, but there's a lot of things in here to discuss. Okay. So for those listening, thinking, oh, it's such an easy to understand essay, I have found numerous new insights every time that I read it. Okay, so meditation in a toolshed is what it sounds. I know some Christians. I've had some students say, I don't like this word meditation. I want to kind of talk just briefly about that for a second. That meditation is a sound biblical word. When we have the Latin word meditatio to reflect, to contemplate seriously or deeply on something. It's not necessarily that we're using it as a non-Western religious sort of context. So I just want to dispel that. It's about a man thinking in a shed. Okay, let's just put it there. We could say, thinking in a tool shed, if you like. And he's probably referring to himself, of course. He says, I was standing there one day and he sees a crack, I believe, in the door and a sunbeam coming in. And we've probably seen those dust mites flying around in a beam of light before. And so we're all kind of familiar with this image. And everything else, he says, was pitch black while he was looking at the beam of light coming through the crack in the wooden door, we presume. When he moved, the beam fell on his eyes, and then he could see, that the whole previous picture vanished, and now he was immersed in this beam of light, was looking out into the world beyond, and saw, as I quote here, framed in the irregular cranny at the top of the door, green leaves moving on the branches of the tree outside and beyond that, 90 odd million miles away, the sun. And then he says, and this gets into what we want to talk about, Miguel, about the distinction. The big theme of the essay is looking along the beam and looking at the beam are very different experiences. The whole rest of the essay is a series of examples taken from, you might even say, anthropology, theology, science, even brain science. He refers to a neurologist at one point, a mathematician. Lots of really concrete, very good examples that help us to understand what looking at is versus, and maybe I shouldn't say versus because they're not antagonistic, but what looking at is, as opposed to looking along. And then he finishes with an important point we'll get to later, a sort of a takeaway point.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for doing that. So let's go ahead and dive right into this. The essential kind of component that we need to pull away from this is this distinction that Lewis makes between looking at and looking along. How might we best understand what it means to look at something?
Sure, I can, in fact, just circumvent Lewis for a second and go to an example I recently gave from Myth Became Fact, another essay in this collection where he kind of talks again about epistemology and metaphysics and myth and how those all go together. And he gives a number of different examples, like pain. He does here too in this essay, humor. So to best, I think, try to understand the difference between the two, think of a wonderful song from any genre that you've grown very fond of, and it's on your playlist. And I tell my students, okay, when you first listen to the song, are you analyzing it? Are you dissecting the lyrics? If it's a lyrical song, if it's instrumental, are you trying to get your music theory textbook out? Probably not. And I have gotten a few smart alecks that say yes, but most people are just kind of taken with it. Oh, the rhythm, the melody, the chorus is great. And did you hear those lyrics? Oh, that totally gets me. It grabbed me. You're not when we're doing this, we're not looking at a piece of music. Looking at a piece of music would be looking at the underlying structure of why these notes were chosen, why this time signature was chosen, why these lyrics, not those lyrics. To question who the author is, the artist, etc. It's very analytical. It's abstract, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's looking at. Looking along is stepping into the song or stepping into the myth, and because in Myth Became Fact, that's what he talks about, story, and this has a lot to do with that. By the way, these essays really could be read together, and if you're interested, if your students and mine are interested, as I know they are, usually about myth, this is very a good example would be to swap out songs with stories. Looking along a myth or looking along a song is how I first started off this example. It's you're seized by an experience. It's a subjective experience. Of course, looking at art and experiencing beauty always is subjective, at least in part, as it takes place in the subject, that is us, in our minds and brains. And it's a deeply subjective experience, but that's not all it is. So when we're arrested by beauty, when we're seized by it, when we're stopped by it, as Terry Gillespie puts in one of his books that I love, when it serves as an alarm clock for us and it's just woken us to something, we're looking along the beam. We're immersed in the music. We're immersed in maybe the story, the underlying myth. Many classical musical pieces have myths that they're based on, right? We're in it, and we're not even really thinking about that myth. We're not thinking. We're thinking about the emotions because we're experiencing them. And then we go back and forth between these two ways of knowing. When finally we're sick and tired of scratching our heads and wondering why this song affects me so much, we might finally just give up and look it up. We'll research the artist, we'll research the era that it was written in, and so on and so forth. And now we're back to looking at the song, right? And a certain kind of quality, and maybe certain kind of quality of experience is lost when we do that. But it's never, and I never want to tell my students that it's a bad versus good. Looking at is better than looking along. We want to avoid that way of talking about these two ways of knowing. And I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, that's really important. I think understanding, if we're going to understand Lewis correctly here, he is not suggesting to only look along, right? Although if one reads it, it's like, well, he seems to kind of have a negative kind of reaction. He only has a negative reaction to only looking at, to the belief that all that matters is looking at, and looking along is not important. Now, I also think it's important for us to go a bit further and say, as you stated, this essay is about knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not saying looking at is how we know things, in fact. And then looking along is just important because the experience, or, all of that. That's not what he's saying. What he's actually saying is, if we only ever look at things, we are going to be missing out on a significant amount of knowledge that we could have. If we truly want to know the way things are, we need to both look at and look along.
Well, that's a very important point, Miguel. I appreciate you pointing that out. I mean, it's something he says towards the end of the essay, in fact, is that we must both look at and along everything. Neither good nor bad, or one is better or worse. Both are necessary. And yeah, some people who have read this think he's against science. Quite the contrary. He's simply saying that there's a philosophy of science. There is a experience of a mathematician, physicist, a neurologist that is purely subjective for them as well, that they can't not look along either. It's not as if they have some satellite position to observe things from, as so many scientists often pretend that they have, that science affords them this, putative sort of independence or objectivity, and it's just not true. So he's simply railing against it because we have, in the modern time since the Enlightenment, prized and overemphasized, we might say, logos, or looking at, as the only means of getting knowledge. And what you said is exactly right: is that you're only getting half the picture there. It's an important part of it. It's not only inevitable that we get it, but it's crucial. It's essential that we get both. So yeah, I just
Yeah.
want to double down on that.
And so the way that he goes about arguing for this, right? Because he doesn't just assert it. He doesn't just say you have to look at and look along. He gives numerous examples
Yeah.
of situations in which if you only look at, you will actually miss out on the more important truth, on the
Mm,
more important aspects of whatever it is that you're seeking to understand.
mm.
So are there any of those examples that maybe resonated with you, or that you really like, of the ones that he offers?
I do. I wanted to mention one more thing. That's a great
Sure.
question.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the essay, where he's setting up this distinction, this relationship, complementarity between looking at and looking along, he says, I was seeing the beam, not seeing things by it. As I know, there's a famous quote that Lewis, it's often quoted of Lewis, from Is Theology Poetry, which is in the Weight of Glory collection for those interested. And he says this famous quote that's become famous: I believe in Christianity like I believe the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. I may have missed a word in there, I'm just realizing, but the gist is there, is that this is an important part of what he's getting at, is that in order to understand anything fully, we have to see things by it. We have to step inside the experience, and that's being kind of, there's been a lot of pushback against that, especially with religious experience, and people saying, oh, well, you can't trust a person's religious experience. Well, how else are we supposed to talk about it? We experience it. We can't just say, okay, hold on, I'm going to take my eyeballs out and look at myself. No, we can't step outside of it. Again, just important to emphasize that. As to your question, my favorite one, and I know people have pointed out, obviously Lewis kind of dates himself here with some of the language about the Nyanga savage. Obviously this is more of an anthropological, ritualistic, mythological example he gives. But my favorite one, because I've been reading a lot about the mind, body, brain, mind, alleged distinction, which has been talked about a lot today, is about the physiologist towards the end of the essay. And he says, a physiologist can study pain and find out that it is, whatever is means, such and such neural events. We could look at a brain scan, for example. But the word pain would have no meaning for him unless he had been inside by actual suffering. Now, he says exactly the same sort of thing in Myth Became Fact, right? He says, when you're looking at or thinking about contemplating pain with a capital P as an abstract platonic form, you're not actually experiencing it. It's only when you have a toothache and you wish it would stop, he says in that essay, that you can really ever know it at all. But when you try to think about it, when you're experiencing pain, it's very hard to, because you're driven deep into that subjective, concrete experience. And then he concludes here by saying, if he had never looked along pain, he simply wouldn't know what he was looking at. The very subject. So again, I love how many scientifically inclined people will look at religion or in theology, the study of God and religion, and say, well, oh, I just don't see how you believe this. And it's most likely because they haven't tried to look at the evidence objectively, to step inside. They've looked at it, they haven't looked along it.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, that's excellent. That is one of my very favorite examples that he gives.
It's a good
So I'm
one.
glad you raised it. So for those listening, maybe that was kind of a lot to take in, right? So
Sure.
here's kind of the summary of that, right? So looking at, if we're talking about, because keep in mind, a lot of people want to reduce our experiences, or our kind of mental capacities to just the brain, right? And so to look at pain would be to simply see what someone does or is experiencing from that kind of outside perspective. So if we're reducing things to brain waves, looking at pain would be, okay, what parts of the brain light up when people are in pain, right?
Exactly.
Okay. But in this example, if that's all you know about pain is, oh, people's brains light up when they're experiencing this thing we call pain, you know almost nothing about pain, right? The only reason those lights and brain waves are significant is because you've experienced pain and now you have an idea of what that person is experiencing. And so so I think it's really important for us to understand, like, this is a really important kind of distinction that Lewis is making. And again, it's not just kind of wanting to place kind of importance on our experiences for experience sake. It's saying, no, this is actually how we come to know things, is through that kind of experience. And to fail to experience that is to fail to understand.
Oh, yeah, that's such a good point, Miguel. I really think that for students who struggle, at least, and I know they struggle in your classes too, probably, about this subjective objective distinction. We always get stuck in this dance at first where, we talk about beauty. Okay, it's pure subjectivism. It's beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We take that, and then we look at subjectivism / relativism in, we might say, metaphysics, or more broadly speaking, philosophy. That to each his or her own. You have your truth. I have my truth. They have their truth over there in that culture. And I think that this essay helps a lot with resolving the intuitive sense that we all get, that it has to be somewhat subjective, but clearly it can't be all subjective.
Yeah.
Because as soon as we start bringing up examples, and somebody, in my class recently said, well, yeah, we all have our own truth. And I go, well, I think I know what you're saying. We all have our own perception of truth based on the kind of person we are, our experiences, where we're standing, our perception. But how would you know that your truth is true without a truth with a capital T? And then another one said, and this is just so commonplace to hear that, it's got to be true that there's no truth. I mean, how would we know it? I go, well, you just, kind of
asserted a truth claim.
Yeah. So we all intuitively know it. And just because it's difficult to find the truth about something doesn't mean that there is no truth, or just because a problem seems difficult. Or, for example, when we talk about aesthetics, I think you've probably read the book. I'm trying to think. It's Joseph someone, the Art of Beauty or something like that. It was recommended by a colleague, but it's a really great book about aesthetics. And he's talking about two friends looking at a bridge. It's got all this graffiti. It's run down. One says, ugh, how can you find that beautiful? And he says, well, maybe this person had his first kiss under there, or maybe they see something about, like in Japanese culture, we know that the Japanese love and appreciate, broken things, right? He sees something that you don't, doesn't mean that it's subjective. The very fact that you disagree actually presupposes that beauty is objective. What we know, beauty is, there's an essence, it's intrinsic in things. But again, that's looking at the same point, how to get there, how to even think about these things. We have to step inside them. We have to look along them.
Yeah,
So
I've actually adopted the language in class of looking at and looking along. I will refer back to it throughout the whole semester. This is the first thing we read in class.
Yeah.
And I actually have stopped using the language of objective and subjective.
Good for you.
I think I first heard this from Thomas Bogardus. He's a Catholic philosopher. And he said that these words, as is true of many words in our culture today, he's like, I think they've become so confused that it's just not helpful to, and I don't know that it's not ever helpful to use them, but I have said, you know what, I'm going to buy into that. And I'm just going to kind of sidestep all of that.
I think that's
we
wise.
do still talk about relativism and stuff like that, but objective, subjective, I've
Yeah.
kind of set aside, and I just talk about looking at, looking along.
Better.
I'm not suggesting those are synonyms, but I
Mm.
think they get the job done insofar as what I'm concerned with doing in class. And
Well,
so,
I couldn't agree more. I might be following suit soon, but I think too why they're better is that they're imaginative. That is they can really only best be understood. And here's the irony of it: to understand these concepts, we have to find an example that enables us to look on and look at simultaneously. For Lewis, that would mean a great image or a moving story, a myth, in his words. And so, the fact that he starts this essay with a mini parable of sorts, of images, a man, a shed, a beam of light, a sun, a garden's trees, is very significant to the theology of the imagination that Lewis really subscribed to, and that people like Michael Ward today have continued, and Holly Wardway and others that are working in Paul Gould, all of those people working in
right.
imaginative and cultural apologetics. It's very
Yeah,
important.
excellent.
Yeah.
Very good. And so I want to give another one of the examples that I really enjoy, especially if maybe you're listening and the science thing doesn't quite do it for you. He
Mhm.
actually also uses the example of falling in love. And I think this is a really powerful example
Yeah.
because so imagine if somebody who's never been in love says to you, "What does it mean to be in love?"
Mm.
And you have a biologist or a chemist or somebody who studies anatomy who comes along and says, well, love is when these chemicals are released in the body and this reaction happens and this reaction happens.
Mm.
Man, if in a sense, right, that does correspond with being in love.
Mhm.
But if that's all we know about being in love, then
Oof.
we know almost nothing
Ain't
about
that the
being in
truth?
love, right? And
Mm.
so you go and you search out the lover, you don't search out the person that's going to reduce it to brainwaves, right? And
Sure.
so and again, we're not just talking about, oh, the experience is so meaningful. No,
Mm.
we're saying in order to know, in order to gain knowledge about what love is,
Yeah.
there's something tied to the experience.
Sure.
Okay. So
So good
I
example.
think
Yeah.
I love that you brought up the brain example because I love that one. And then I
Yeah.
think the love one gives us a very practical, kind of straightforward example too. I love this essay. I really
I
do.
do.
So here's
It's
my
easy to see
question
why.
then,
Yeah.
right? And I have some ideas, but I want to
Mhm.
hear from you on it.
Okay.
Clearly, one of Lewis's uh, motivations in writing something like this is to challenge the way that people oftentimes talk about religion.
Mm.
Um, Oftentimes, I think he actually says it. I don't have it right in front of me, but basically says something along the lines of, we live in a society that says you go to the anthropologist to
Mm.
know the truth about religion, not the religious practitioner, right?
Mm.
And again, I'm paraphrasing, but he
That's
essentially
about
that's
right.
what he says, which
Mhm.
I think is still true of our own society,
Oh,
given,
yeah.
that a lot of time has passed since Lewis's day, but I would say
Sure.
it's still true, right? You go
Absolutely.
to the anthropologist or the social scientist or
Right.
whoever for the
Right.
truth. And
Yeah.
then, the religious practitioner is just the person that just kind of blindly
Feelings. Yeah.
believes and feelings, right?
Yeah. Right.
Okay. So, if this is supposed to, in some sense, guide us in religious investigation,
Mhm.
we can't become everything, right? I can't become
Mm.
a Buddhist and a Hindu and a Muslim and a Christian in my lifetime, right? Nor would I suggest that people go about experimenting in that way necessarily, right?
Mm. Mhm.
So, if Lewis is saying look at and look along, how can I look along when committing myself to a religious investigation? Let's say that I'm
Ah.
learning about various religions. Maybe I'm in a class and I'm
Mhm.
learning about all these different world religions, or I have a neighbor who's of a different religion than I am or that I've grown up with, right? How do I apply this looking at, looking along to the question of which religion is true or how should I go about a religious investigation?
Ooh, there's so many good things there to talk about. I'm going to organize my thoughts for a second. I think the first place we need to start is backing up a little bit, and then you can put me back on track because my brain's moving faster,
Sure.
I think, than my mouth right now. So, um, trying to think. I think the best place to start is later on. He goes back to the neurologist example, or the physician, or whatever it was, physiologist. I think he says,
Right.
where he says that if the thought that all thoughts are just simple, firings of or neurons and the tiny particles in the gray matter moving about. If that's all it is, then so is that thought that's all it is. Which means that the person who is an anthropologist or a sociologist or a psychologist or all of the above, who is going to reduce the religious experience and religious, allegedly, true religious speech and knowledge to just a chemical event that's based on chemicals and feelings, is completely just undercut their own point of view. They would have to be fair, to apply that thesis to themselves, which they won't do, because they're going to assume some sort of objective superiority because they're scientific. But again, if you're going to be applying the razor, you have to apply it to your own philosophy. And so they would have to apply this to the philosophy of science and realize that they're in the same boat. So what I always tell my students is, therefore, properly understood faith, there is a certain, which comes from a Greek word pistis, meaning to entrust or trust because of evidence. Then the scientist has, as even Nietzsche admitted it in one of his writings, faith. Right? We have to have faith in the scientific enterprise. We're not as objective as we presume. So there's that. Now, as to the concerned parent, who might be worried that their children are wavering in the faith, or wanting to go to a Hindu temple and maybe, investigate there, or maybe interested in Islam, another kind of monotheistic tradition, or to the seeker who is trying to find out where he or she belongs in picking a tradition, to your question, I think a couple things need to be said. So in order to really look along and also subsequently look at, and I suggest it should be in that order, is you go to the myths, you go to the scriptures, you go to, let's see, I can give some examples here for those of you that are interested. Go to, for instance, I don't know the whole corpus of the I think it was the Tipitakas in Buddhism. There's so many baskets of knowledge, I think they're called, in Buddhism, but the Dhammapada is a good starting point. It's like the book of Proverbs. You go there, you go to the early writings of Buddhism that tell you the stories about the four visions and the Four Noble Truths, and you learn the myth of the Buddha and his journey, right? His renunciation of his palace life. You go to the Bhagavad Gita, I think, or the Upanishads, which are more approachable and accessible than the Vedas. You go to the Bible for Judeo-Christian tradition. You go to the Quran for Islam. You go to Hesiod and Homer for the Greeks, among others. You go to Horace and Ovid, among others, in Rome. You go to the myths, and you step inside and therefore look along the myth, and you understand now how this person within this culture sees the world. You have to inhabit them. And the best way you can do that, because we know that we can't swap consciousness with somebody else. The idea that consciousness exists, I know, is contested, but let's just assume it is. You'll never really know what it's like to be an ancient Roman or an ancient Egyptian or so on and so forth.
Right.
But this was your question before we get to the, how do we know which one is kind of true, or how can we decide? And you had hinted at too, you're not necessarily suggesting that we should try out, so to speak, every religion. And I agree, especially from a Christian point of view, it's not necessary. So you go to the myths, you interview people of the tradition, you meet people, you show them love and compassion and understanding, and you listen, and then you pull back and you look at, then you decide, then you follow the evidence and come to your own conclusions. And I think that has to be guided by something. And it has to be guided by this pursuit of, I want to know the right story about the world. I want things to make sense. I don't think anybody approaches this saying, I want things to be confusing. It's just this ancient desire in us to want to have things fit in. So that's what you do. You then look at and you find out, does this narrative fit with reality? Does this one? How are these that are very similar how are they dissimilar? Because they can't all be true, as you
Right.
also hinted at. So I'll pause there, but I think there's more
Okay.
to say.
Good. No,
Yeah.
that's helpful. So, one of the ways that we could look along
Mhm.
various world religions is by exploring their scriptures, their
Mhm.
teachings, right? I also want to make a quick point of clarification for the audience, for those that maybe aren't as familiar. So, Michael, as a professor of humanities, is using this word myth in a very particular way. He's
Mm.
not using it pejoratively, and he's not attaching that to the way that we commonly use the word myth to mean something that's false,
Right.
right? But rather, and this is just kind of my super simple quick definition that I use in class, a myth is stories people tell to make sense of the world around them, right? So
Perfect.
stories
Yeah.
people tell to make sense of the world around them.
Yep.
Now, some of those stories may turn out to be true, some of those stories may turn out to be false, but they are
Mhm.
stories that people tell to make sense of the world around them. And
Agreed.
so when you use myth, I think you mean something like that. I don't want to put my words in your mouth, but
No,
I
that's
figure
exactly what I mean.
that.
Precisely.
And so I would also add, so that's helpful. I think scriptures, teachings, I would say it also involves listening to the people that practice those religions. That
Mm.
part that we oftentimes want to skip, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I think we have to challenge our. Sometimes we have like naturalistic presuppositions, So
Mhm.
what I appreciate about it is, so he towards the end does reference um kind of a tribal person who and if I remember correctly, there's like a mention of some kind of fertility ritual and a rain dance or
Mm.
something. I think those are
Mhm.
the two examples he uses.
Yeah.
And so before you just ride that off,
Mhm.
and this applies to everyone, regardless of what religious tradition they land in,
Yep.
before you just ride that off,
Yeah.
if we're going to look at and look along, the question is to the person who believes that, why do you believe this? Or what
Exactly.
experiences have you had when you participate in these rituals, right?
Precisely. Yeah.
And so I think there's two important points here. One, there is no need to just, in a kind of prejudiced way, write it off without even learning about it, right? Like we want to understand it. What exactly is it that you think's going on when
Mhm.
you participate in these rituals? When
Mhm.
you do participate in the rituals, does the desired outcome come about, right? You
Mm.
want to listen to the people who are on the inside. This is what I tell my students. You can't be an insider on everything, but you
Yeah.
can listen to insiders, right? You can
Love that.
hear what they have to say.
Yeah.
So that's part one. But part two, because I think, again, this is one of those unquestioned assumptions that oftentimes comes up,
Uh.
is Lewis is not saying that we can't question people's experiences.
Mm-mm.
He's not saying that looking along is this kind of infallible, never mistaken, all of our, because the reality is experiences have to be interpreted.
Of
And
course.
so I think he actually says something towards the end like, you may have good reasons
Mhm.
for believing that that's not the way rain works, right?
Yeah.
That you perform some kind of dance and then rain, right? So what he's saying is, you look along,
Mm.
and I appreciate what you said, maybe look along first, then look at, right?
Perhaps. Yeah, I
But
think.
once you've
Mm.
done both,
Yeah.
it may be that you're looking at provides you with some information that
Mm.
says, I think this person has misinterpreted the experience that they've
Oh, yeah, that's
had,
a
right?
really
And
good
okay,
point.
that fair enough.
Yeah.
Now, other times, what we're going to see, and I think this is why it's essential to do both, as you said,
Yeah.
other times what we're going to see is we're going to look at, and when we look along, it
Yeah.
sheds light on things that we did not understand or could not understand when we were looking at. So this is why you
That's
always have
right.
to do both.
Yeah.
One of them is not better than the other. They're
No.
different, but they complement each other.
That's
And the
right.
only way that we can be sure that we
Yeah.
haven't overlooked something significant is if we're looking at and looking along.
I think what you just said might be the most important thing we've said so far, because this is about validating and checking our two experiences. And I think a brief reading from Myth Became Fact here will help expand this a little bit, if I could.
Okay. Yeah.
But just to piggyback on the excellent stuff you just said, we have to interpret experience. So there's no self-interpreting story. News is not self-interpreting, and neither is experience. I mean, a lot of people do think I I feel therefore it's true, but that's obviously not the direction
Right.
we want to go in here. Well, I feel strongly about this, and it's my truth. Well, okay. Just because we use words in a sentence doesn't, I think, what to quote the Princess Bride, I do not think you know, I don't think you know what that word means, or something like
Right. I
that,
don't
right?
think that means what you think it means or
That's
something.
it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I love that line. So yeah, we have to pull back and look. Okay, so for interested listeners, how do we do that? Just a quick kind of, there's lots of scholars who write about the various criteria we need to sort of look at in order to know whether this is a valid experience. But I think the Aristotelian tried and true correspondence theory, does this correspond? Does this experience accurately reflect human experience, the valid human experience, and reality itself? Does it ring true of? And is there supporting, corroborating evidence for this thing I've experienced? And what kind of evidence is it? And then there's all sorts of different directions we can go in there after that. But yeah, so that is, Lewis says, this is my favorite part of the essay. This is Myth Became Fact. He says, this is our dilemma: either to taste and not to know, or to know and not to taste. So knowing would be looking at, tasting here would be looking along. Or he says more strictly, to lack one kind of knowledge, there's that word, because we are in an experience, we're looking along, right? We're lacking abstract knowledge when we do that. Or to lack another kind because we're outside it. When we're contemplating pain, we're not really knowing as much as we think about it. As thinkers, we are cut off from what we think about. As tasting, touching, willing, loving, hating, we do not clearly understand. Last line: the more lucidly we think, the more we are cut off. The more deeply we enter into reality, the less we can think.
It's excellent. Yeah,
Yeah.
right on. And I love how, and that's just the way Lewis is. His writings really just interlock and build off of each other in a way that's just so powerful. But
That's truth.
so you had mentioned that there's this kind of takeaway. Have we covered it, or what would you say is the kind of big takeaway here?
I mean, I think you added one with, having to pull back from the experience of looking along and looking at. But mine was simply just that we have got to stop the browbeating of looking
Right.
along, as Lewis says. And we have to recognize, after the, I think, very logical and sound examples that he's given, that we really can't know anything well enough without looking along and looking at. So
Right.
let's stop being unkind to the African tribal individual who practices a religion that just seems
That's right.
pejoratively speaking, just absurd.
Right.
How can these stupid people believe that? You'll hear people say.
Yeah.
And I was just reading an article about famous atheists in Hollywood, and the things that I don't understand, how people can childishly believe in the man in the sky. I'm thinking, well, isn't it just as childish to think there's nothing? I mean, follow that to its logical end, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, he says the browbeating has got to stop. We both have to look along and at everything. I think that's the major takeaway. But I think what you added was an additional one.
Yeah. No,
So yeah.
I'm glad you said that, though. I think that is the key, right?
Mm,
Because if we busy ourselves looking at and looking along, right, seeking to understand, right, seeking to gather the data, gather the information as best we can, but also listen to the insider when we can't be insiders ourselves, right, which
right.
is going to happen sometimes.
Hmm.
Um, then I think we are going to be in a better place. I also think it brings about a place of intellectual humility, because
Absolutely.
now I'm trying to learn from you. I'm
Yeah.
trying to understand your experience. And again, to be clear here, I'm not saying that all experiences are interpreted correctly. I'm not saying we can't
Mm-mm.
question experiences, but we should at least consider them and take them seriously.
Agreed.
And so I think that is, as we seek to find truth, I
Hmm.
think that element is oftentimes overlooked. And I, as you said, and I think you're right on here, we oftentimes just kind of make fun of, kind of just blow off people who we think their ideas are ridiculous.
Certainly.
I think I would rather take ideas that are difficult to take seriously. I'd rather take them seriously
Mhm.
than to potentially not take seriously ideas that I should take seriously. And so
Oh,
I want to
well
make
said.
sure that I'm taking the ideas seriously,
Right?
to better my chances of not overlooking
Something
important
vital.
ideas. Right.
Yeah, you could really overlook something very, very valuable and true. Yeah, and I think it's a on that note, I tell my students we got into a talk about religious pluralism. Or metaphysical pluralism is probably a better way because they were looking up a lot of articles online and saying, well, whenever we look up religious pluralism, it's just this belief that multiple religions can coexist peacefully. And I'm like, well, that's not what I mean by it.
Sure.
We got into the conversation about people shoving ideologies down throats, to quote my students. And I said, well,
Right.
you're right. There are some traditions, sometimes even, yes, Christianity, where we go about this in the wrong way. Where in our tradition, Miguel, we know it's the Holy Spirit's job to really change that person's heart. No matter how much we pray, no matter how much we plant seeds, we can't bring that person. We might even say, like Socrates, we are midwives for the truth. We can't
Right.
birth the child itself for you, but we can help deliver it.
Right.
And so we never want to rob someone of their coming about after a quest of following the evidence for truth by telling them they have to do this, even if it is indeed the case that they have to, as Christians believe that we are saved by faith in Christ alone. Um, I think there's a way to still hold true to that while respecting the individual's pursuit of truth. And of course, it can be very disconcerting sometimes, and knowing that people are so close and yet so far, and we want to push them along. But I think there is a more compassionate way to do it. And I've been trying to perfect that, or improve upon that, I should say, in my own life. And it's very difficult to do, but I think this essay is very helpful for that. And if we want to help people become disciples of any tradition, but especially of Christ, from of course where we're coming from, we have to invite them to look along. We have to say, step into. That's what Jesus did with his parables. So you have to step into it and then look at the evidence and then tell us what you think. Okay. And I just think that's an important point, is that, how we go about it is very important these days. And we don't want to lose people just because we're seen as trying to win the argument, is the point I was trying to arrive at. And that can be sometimes, I think, a problem, that we just want to win the argument instead of realizing that we're in the business of building relationships and winning disciples, helping, the Holy Spirit, but not being the Holy Spirit.
Right.
So,
yeah, no, that's excellent. I appreciate it. I think that's a good way for us to bring it to a close. So, if this has been helpful to you, if you've stuck with us to the very end, we appreciate it. And if this has been helpful, feel free to subscribe. Make sure you like it. Make sure you share it with others. If you have any comments, maybe you're familiar with the essay. Maybe you've taken issue with something that we've said here. We'd be happy to hear it. Please feel free to comment down below. And again, please feel free to visit the YouTube channel. As I said, I'll be posting much more regularly from now on, and so you can expect more content like this. All right. Thanks. And Michael, thank you for joining me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. Thank you, Miguel.